Another feature to look for in a saw blade are right here, little plugs. Now these are copper plugs right here. And copper plugs, the reason why those are desirable to have in your saw blade is in conjunction with the expansion gullet, or not gullets, but the expansion slots, because this is a softer metal filling in that, it tends to quiet the blade down. So you don't get the whine from a blade, especially one running without cutting where it's just making that wah. Matter of fact, I'm going to let John explain the next feature too. So these are desirable, especially as you get into larger blades. The smaller blade, it's not as critical because there's so much less mass there to be worked with.
Right.
When you get into larger and larger blades, a feature like that becomes more desirable because you tend to get a lot more whine out of the saw blade, and that'll help tone it down. Something I never really knew about, and John instructed me on this, but I had it mentioned by saw manufacturers I talked to, are this ring running around the saw here, or, let me hold this one up real quickly.
This blade this is an old blade, but
it's an old blade, but you can still see there are straight lines coming down at several points on the blade. And what's that for, John?
well, they're tensioning marks, and different manufacturers have different ways of tensioning a blade. This one obviously puts a circle around the blade, but what it does is it takes the tension out of the blade so it makes it flat. And same with these. They relieve the tension of the blade from the outside edges, and it keeps the steel flat.
Okay, which is critical, once again, because if you have a blade that tends to take itself out of plane,
Right.
then you basically have something you're just merely going to throw in the trash.
Right. And that's really critical, or it's something that you see when you're cutting things like plastic laminates, melamine products, not so much in wood. When you're cutting a piece of oak or something like that, you're really not going to notice a little tiny bit of run out in a blade on normal instances. But if you're cutting a hard product like pressure treated or high pressure laminate on particle board or MDF, or a melamine product, when you cut through that, if there's any waver in that blade, you're going to see it in the chipping in there. So it's good to have a good straight blade all the time. Now, if you don't have a straight blade, well, not if you don't have a straight blade, but if you're using like a thin curved blade, let's see, this is actually a thin curved blade, and it's very, very much thinner than a standard saw blade. And the reason they do this is to take away less material, and actually that makes a lot of difference in something like cutting an expensive exotic hardwood or expensive veneers. When you're cutting up a lot of strips, it makes a difference. But in that case, what you can do is use a saw stiffener, which we don't happen to have one tonight, but it's a piece of steel that lays on each side of the blade and clamps it so that
We actually have a drawing right there.
We have a drawing of it, but I don't know if you're going to really see that too well. But what it does is it clamps on each side of the blade, and only a portion of the blade that would be cutting is actually exposed in cutting the blade. The rest of it becomes a very thick material, and it also acts as a heat sink.
Mm-hmm. So it prevents the blade from twisting.
Right, exactly.
Although it still should be said, anytime you take your work, if you twist the work on the table, you are going to distort the blade and potentially just destroy it.
Absolutely, absolutely. When you're pushing a large sheet through and it all of a sudden bumps, it's like, that blade's pretty much shot. But, as always, we continue to use them until they're so dull that they smoke, and then we send them out.
Then they're dangerous.
And that's another thing, saw sharpeners are very hard to find. A lot of guys, and I don't want this to sound wrong, but a lot of guys will buy saw sharpening equipment, set up in their basement, and then they're going to go around from shop to shop saying, I'm a saw sharpener. Well, unless they're really qualified, they're not. And they can sharpen the blade, but most of them take off a lot of material if they're not experienced. So you want to go to a good sharpener. We happen to have one up in New York that I used when I was a fabricator in Buffalo, and I've always been using him since. And we have him as a saw surface, and they retip, they straighten the blades, they hammer them, they do everything they need to. They also sharpen spiral cutters, which we'll get into. So if you do need a good sharpening service, you can check our website or call our office. It's something that it'll prolong the life of your blades so much.
Now, very briefly, because we're almost out of time for this segment, some of the typical or the common types of saw teeth that you'll see out there are flat top, which it's just a flat top on the tooth of every blade.
Right.
That's only for ripping material.
That's correct.
And primarily wood.
Right.
Not wood products, but wood itself, like 2x4s and pine. Next, you would have an alternating top bevel, which we talked about earlier.
Right.
And that is going to be used for cross-cutting. That would be used for laminates, particle boards, a lot of things like that.
Right.
And the high alternating.
High AT. And those dull quickly. People need to know that. Your high AT blades dull quickly, but they're a good way to get the most out of the blade.
To cut chip free.
Exactly.
Which is the critical part, and we'll talk about that.
Chip free when they're sharp.
Exactly, and we're going to talk about that as we get into router bits a little bit more. Next would be triple chip grind and modified triple chip.
Right.
And we can talk about that some more after the break because I know that's hanging over our heads.
Okay.